Hi. So the topic will be, and I'm not sure if the title will be the same, but I'll be talking about immortality, sort of diving into why is that an idea? Um, Diving into why is God an idea? Because I think these are very important questions, even though a lot of these are polemical, in terms of theology, and there are a lot of consists of a good portion of debates. But what I find rather intriguing is that the idea of God exists at all, and the idea of immortality exists at all. And where does that root from? Now, I think a very superficial take would be it's just a part of our imagination. It's just men making up things. But even if we take the supposition that it's constitutive of our imaginations, if we take biological evolution seriously, then that means all of these constitutions of our being involves the very idea of God and immortality. Right? So so there's either something that is constitutive of our evolutionary process that involves God and immortality, to explain why we think about those things, or it's just like exactly what people say before. It's just some kind of pure imagination, some type of thing. But a question that came to my mind was, I tried to imagine a world that no one said God existed. Right? So if no one ever said that God existed, no one would need to argue about God's existence. So in essence, everybody would be non-religious. Let's just keep it simple without including Buddhism and other kinds of religions. So everybody would be non-religious. Now this is interesting because it makes me think about when people make the argument that, well, God never existed, and so on. And yet, if that is true in terms of the idea of God, then we would never be arguing about it in the first place. Are you catching what I'm saying? If the idea of God never existed at all, then there would be no reason to assert that God does not exist or exist. But of course, I think this would only be a strong argumentation for the idea of God. But the very fact that it takes something prior, as to say God exists, in order to then deny that God doesn't exist, is rather quite puzzling. Because if we take the evolutionary process seriously, right, going from minerals to plants and animals and then being a human being, if that is the case, what I guess what I'm asking is then, is there something in the very constitution of all things that kind of asserts or knows about some kind of eternity, some kind of immortality, some kind of God? Because to me, it's very possible, right? It's very possible that the world could have come to be in a way that there was no need to argue about God's existence or to assert about God's existence. But the very fact that it is worth being polemical and and that it is even an idea and thought about, and the same thing with immortality and eternity, it makes me question deeper, in the sense, like, do human beings, through their evolutionary process, through this, I guess I'm just going to call it evolutionary consciousness, is there some parts of our evolutionary consciousness that actually knew or knows an eternity, that knows a God, that knows immortality? Now, again, I'm not trying to get into sort of pointing out a certain religion or anything. What I'm trying to get at, because that can all succumb to misinterpretation, but what I'm really trying to get at is that, is there something rather natural to asserting this very idea of God, immortality, eternity? And it's really quite puzzling, because if it is very possible that the world never needed God's existence and so forth, then, well, why is it an actual idea? Why is it something that has sort of thrived for like centuries? I find that even more strange. It's not like, I think a very superficial argumentation will be like, well, it's because we have free will and we have the capacity to reason, to think, and to make things up, and to assert random imaginations like a flying spaghetti monster and so forth. But even if we were to say that someone believes in a flying spaghetti monster and they believe them to be a deity, that still wouldn't answer my question. It's the very fact that human beings feel the need to assert a deity at all, right? I think my question is, if it's possible to never assert a deity, then why did we ever? And if it's possible to have never asserted some kind of eternity or immortality through myths and stories, then why we assert them at all? Why is that some kind of desire? You could say, why does that desire exist at all? Now, desire is interesting because typically if you desire something, there's a sense of knowing that it exists, right? I have a hard time imagining desiring something that doesn't exist, right? If we just, without including God or immortality or anything, it's the very fact that we desire at all. The very object of desire, we assume its existence, right? So if I desire a donut today, I am desiring it because I assume its existence to a degree, right? I wouldn't be desiring it if I didn't think it actually existed. So what I'm trying to get at here is, why do human beings need, and not all human beings, of course, but why do human beings desire to assert that there is some kind of deity, right? Now, this can be one God, many gods. Why is there this desire to assert this? And why is there a desire to assert some kind of immortality and so on? And now I'm not really including the objection to God doesn't exist, because there is no desiring involved in that, right? It's just it's a rebuttal, right? It's a rebuttal to a proposition that was first asserted. So I can't use the argumentation of, well, I desire God not to exist. Well, that's strange, because you're already using God as a existent idea, factor in your argumentation to object to something. But it's the very fact that people desire some kind of entity, right? Desire some kind of eternal life, immortality. And so that's very strange. I think that's very strange. And if you trace the histories down, I've done some preliminary research on this. I think a documentary on some of the ancient religions and stuff. Even if we take, often there's argumentation over, well, monotheism and polytheism. Well, that's a different kind of argumentation. But the very fact that people felt the need to assert any kind of deities at all is interesting, right? This desire to, and the reason why I'm using desire, and maybe some people disagree, but like, well, people don't desire God to say that he exists. They just believe that he exists. Well, the strange connection with believing is that they desire enough to believe. And so that's also strange. And God and immortality and all these become very strange objects of desire. But I would say probably immortality, or the desire to extend your life, is more rooted in the idea of immortality than anything else. But these thoughts of immortality and God are very connected, right? Some of the very first assertions about God are that, he's eternal, he lives forever, the beginning and the end, and so forth. And then we desire immortality and desire eternity. And it's just strange absurdities in terms of, we don't actually see eternity and we don't actually see immortality, yet we desire them, right? And even when people get to sort of the last stages of their lives, they want to live. They want some kind of thing to look forward to through death. Why is that a desire? Because if we put those metaphysical concepts aside, everything else we desire is existent. Right? I desire a new car. Well, I can't desire it unless it exists. I desire, quite a few new books. Well, I can't desire it if I don't believe that it exists. And so it's strange, because then it goes from desiring God, desiring immortality, desiring eternity in some other life. And so it becomes questionable and pondering and wondering seriously if there is something rather that constitutes our evolutionary consciousness of coming to being, that actually knows and that actually has a very vague knowing of this God or deities and immortality and eternity. It's like just this vague knowing. It's like if you were to just wake up into amnesia, but there's this vague idea that you know you had a name, right? So you desire to learn your name because you get this vague feeling that you know you have a name. So yeah, that's I think that's worth contemplating. Really, it's not to I'm not here to kind of assert any specific religion, but I think it's rather interesting when we look at the historical process of the human being, how religion has just lasted so long. It almost seems it's basically undeniable that there's a sort of natural religious quality to man to assert some kind of deity, and create myths and stories and so forth, right? Whether we believe these stories to be true or not, it's the very fact that these qualities come into the very existence and that these myths exist and so forth. I think this is a lot to reflect on and chew on, because it can't be just as dismissive, as denying maybe a certain dogma of religion, but more the generalities of a deity or deities in general. The idea, it seems almost, a part of nature, just completely nature, completely natural to come to these tendencies, right? Even in my own experience with people that sort of deny, God's existence and eternity and so forth, it's typically rooted in just bad experiences with the people participating in religion, right? And the things religion has does the things religion has done in the sake of their God or religion, right? So they're typically moral and kind of experiential discuss for this, in believing. But what I'm trying to pose here is that even if you strip away the moral and the disgusting acts some religions have done, it still doesn't quite answer why those ideas exist. For as long as they've existed, it doesn't quite explain the sort of fervent quality it has to it. It's very captivating to the masses. And I think it would be very superficial to say that, well, people are just dumb and they can be manipulated. And maybe that's true, but it's the very fact that such an enormous amount of people can be gathered by this, right? And provoked by it, inspired by it, and even disgusted by it. We can't deny its powerful repulsion and powerful attraction. It's almost like it's very in tune with nature itself, in terms of, nature. There's definitely instances of, strong attraction and strong repulsion. It seems very consistent with nature in terms of generalities such as religion can gather and religion can divide. And this would be consistent with the conflicts of nature itself, gathering and dividing. So it's much to ponder on, I believe, and there's lots to flesh out on that. Because again, it's, to me, it's very possible that, why does religion exist rather than not exist? It's, I think, a perfectly valid question. Uh, why do those ideas exist rather than not exist and why they existed for so long, and why is it still existing today? I think there's a lot of power and mystery behind those questions, and I think any sort of superficial answer to those, such as, oh, it's just manipulation and power hungry people, I think that's rather a superficial take to something very deep, and um, seems to have a lot more layers than just manipulation and just a hunger for power, right? And just pure imaginations, right? Because even one man's imagination is rarely that captivating for masses, right? Very, very rarely. Um, Very rarely. And even then, it comes to a question of, well, if then is a part of our, imagination is also part of our evolutionary consciousness, if we want to assert that, right? If we came from minerals and plants and animals and so forth, then, imagination is a part of that, right? I don't think I don't think imagination, the capacity to imagine, just sort of came into being randomly. If it's a part of an evolutionary process as well, then had to be things and minerals and that had some kind of a little bit of a very primitive version of imagination. I would never say I would never include to the extent that they had consciousness, but maybe we need to revamp and what we mean by imagination and what we mean by consciousness and so forth. But anyways, these are all things that I think are interesting and worth considering.